and one could say Dow Chemical, because Dow Chemical is the largest producer of chlorine worldwide. They're based in Midland, Michigan. They're the largest producer of chlorine, and what they basically do is they extract salt out of the earth, and through a process called electrolysis, they pump huge amounts of electricity into the salt atom, and through that, they split the salt atom, they get chlorine gas and sodium hydroxide. And what the petrochemical industry does, it takes this chlorine gas and combines it with a whole variety of different petrochemicals to produce these chlorine-based compounds called the organochlorines. And there are about 11,000 different organochlorines that are produced right now for industry. And if you look at any list of toxic chemicals that's either been produced by the Environmental Protection Agency or by other agencies, if you look at, we've been hearing a lot about the endocrine disruptors, more than half of those chemicals are going to have a chlorine base. Some of those chemicals that we're talking about the PCBs, the DDT, dioxin, it's the chlorine and the chlorofluorocarbons, those CFCs that are destroying the Earth's protective ozone layer. So there's a common link in most of the most notorious chemicals that we're talking about today. Did I say dioxin? Dioxin is the most toxic synthetic chemical known to humankind. And this isn't even produced on purpose. This is an accidental byproduct of some of the chlorine manufacturing, use, and production industries. These chemicals, they have three things in common. Number one, they're persistent. It means that they don't break down into the environment. They're incompatible with the ecosystem. When it gets out into the environment, nature doesn't know what to do with these chemicals. Number two, they're toxic, which means that they were produced because they were meant to kill. And then the third thing is they're bioaccumulative. And what bioaccumulative means is that they're fat-loving, they're fat-soluble. They like to concentrate in fats. And so as they move up the food chain, they become increasingly toxic and potent. And in fact, it's the nursing infant who is at the apex of the food chain, right at the very top, who probably receives the largest dose of these toxic chemicals it will ever receive in its lifetime. In fact, if the Food and Drug Administration regulated human breast milk, it would have to be pulled off the grocery shelf because it is so contaminated with these toxic chemicals. Now that's a horrifying statement to say something like this. And this is totally avoidable because there are readily available clean alternatives that can be implemented, which is what Archie is going to also talk about. Our major exposure pathway as human beings is actually through the food chain. These chemicals, they like to concentrate in fat, and so they concentrate particularly in meat, dairy products, fish, and eggs. So, in fact, almost 90% of our exposure directly comes through the very food that we're eating. So this is a really good call to start supporting organic agriculture, start supporting those family farms, and start eating lower on the food chain. So, there are four major uses of chlorine, and they all affect the Louisiana economy in particular because of the types of industries that are located right here in Louisiana. The major user of chlorine is for the production of plastics, in particular the polyvinyl chloride, or the PVC plastics, or vinyl. It's like anywhere you look these days, there's lots of vinyl all over the place. Buildings, for the most part, are being produced with large amounts of vinyl. In fact, there's a company in Canada that is producing 100% PVC or vinyl houses and shipping them out to the developing countries. This is totally unacceptable. This is a highly toxic product that produces these organochlorines in its production, in their use, and their disposal when they're burned in many of these incinerators that we find in our communities today. Some of the uses of vinyl are linoleum, wallpaper, window frames, Barbie. Barbie is made out of vinyl. It's all over in our environment. The chlorine industry, Dow Chemical would say that if we were to phase out chlorine today, that we would unravel the very fabric of life upon which life is based. Now to me, that's a pretty arrogant statement to make because these chemicals didn't even come into full force until the 1940s, the dawn of the chemical age. And they were actually originally used as agents of war during World War II, and there were tremendous stockpiles of chlorine left. And that's when the pesticide industry really took off. The second major user of chlorine is the pulp and paper industry. You guys all know about the pulp and paper industry here in Louisiana. Pulp and paper industry uses large amounts of chlorine gas to bleach pulp white. This is totally unnecessary. Here's the report, and I urge you to pick this report up that Greenpeace produced on 100% totally chlorine-free paper. This can be done. The alternatives are ready and waiting to be used. We need to start fighting for these clean alternatives so that we're not creating all these health crises that we're seeing in our communities today. The third major user of chlorine is in the solvents industry. The solvents industry, particularly the electronics and in the auto industry. And these industries use these solvents as degreasers to clean different parts. So they use large amounts of these chlorine products right in the solvents industry. Another big solvent user is in the dry cleaning industry. How many people have a dry cleaner located in their communities or right around the block? What's really interesting, and this is a really good success story, is that the Environmental Protection Agency did a report as a part of their pollution prevention plan. And what they did is they looked at the dry cleaning industry. The dry cleaning industry uses a chemical called PERC, or perchloroethylene, to so-called clean our clothes. And what they found out is that there are, once again, clean alternatives that are waiting. Soap and water, what a concept. What they did is they compared the dry cleaning industry, which uses PERC, to the wet cleaning industry as an alternative that used the basic soap and water. They found out that the wet cleaning industry, number one, through the use of soap and water, it had just the same effects, if not better, as the industry that used the highly toxic chemical. Number two, it employed more people. And number three, it was cheaper. So this is a really good success story about how pollution prevention really pays. And there's an excellent fact sheet on the Greenpeace table out there about wet cleaning and how we can work to bring these wet cleaning companies right into our own communities. There are two in New York right now. There's one in Chicago. We really need to start getting these wet cleaning companies right into our communities. And then finally, the fourth big user, although it's only actually 2% of all the chlorine used today, but it's a really important one, is the pesticides industry, which you all know about a lot right here in Louisiana. The pesticide industry is one that's heavily dependent upon chlorine. 96% of all pesticides used are either chlorine-based or chlorine was used in the manufacture of these pesticides. And some of the scientific information that we're seeing right now out there is that women who have breast cancer have 50 to 60% higher levels of these organochlorine pesticides in their breast tissue than women who don't. The women...
I think that was overturned by a larger, later study.
Well, there's actually about 4 studies that confirm that actual percentage. There was one study that came out. It was called what was done by Nancy Krieger.
Which overturned that.
Well, actually, Deborah Lee Davis talked about that this morning. And what this study did, it looked at 3 populations. It looked at Asian American women, it looked at African American women, and it looked at white women. And for African American women and for white women, there was definitely a strong, statistically significant correlation between these organochlorine pesticides and breast cancer. For the Asian American women, there was no correlation. And what Deborah Lee Davis said this morning is that it could be because of the Asian American diet. The Asian American diet is really high in what are called antioxidants, are those foods that are really protect us from cancer, those foods like the soy-based products, broccoli, other products like that that aren't accumulating a lot of these toxic chemicals. So if you look more closely at that study, there are definitely statistically significant correlations for African American women and for white women. Let's see what else. And finally, let's see. I think I'm going to leave it right there and hand it over to either Archie or Florence. And then what we could wrap it up with is what we can do with this information and how we can really begin to take some action. Because there are some really concrete ideas out there that we can do.
Let's finish letting everyone talk and then, write your question down, we don't wanna miss it. Go ahead.
Let me go? All right, we'll hand these out.
Okay.
I have a prepared statement here I was going to read from, but instead what I'm going to do is basically talk to you on a one-on-one and basically make a statement that all of the papers that you're holding in your hands today, except for a few of the ones that have been produced with green fees, and obviously the papers that we're going to hand out here today, have contributed to the chlorine industry and have also contributed to the organic chlorine problem. So all of the papers that you're using here today, you're actually contributing to your own problems by buying and purchasing these products. And what we would like to do here today is explain to you a little bit how paper and pulp is produced so that you can get an understanding when it comes time to purchasing something, how to best make your choices. Now from our standpoint, what we feel is important is you should only have to ask 3 questions when it comes to procurement of paper. We want to make it very simple, very easy for you. The 3 questions that you need to ask are: 1, is the virgin fiber totally chlorine-free? That's very important because that's what the big mills make all of their money on. And that's where all the trees are cut, and that's where all the virgin products are produced. So really the first thing you want to find out is the virgin fiber totally chlorine-free, because that's very important. The second part of it is the post-consumer waste, or post-consumer fiber, which we prefer to call fiber than waste, is it rebleached with chlorine or chlorine-containing compounds? And then the third thing that you need to know is how much post-consumer fiber is in the product. The higher the content, the better. Now, if you can optimize those 3 things in your paper procurements, you're going to be helping make a change in the pulp and paper industry, and you're also going to be voting with your dollars. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today, how you can make a difference in voting with your dollars. There's a lot of confusion, and I talked to a lot of my friends here about the different kinds of papers. Everybody searched out. They're trying to do their best in figuring out what is the most environmentally benign paper I can buy. And almost all of you here would probably say, well, geez, 100% recycled paper is the most environmentally benign paper that you should buy. I tend to disagree with that. Because what that tells you is that the way the pulp and paper industry works, first off, you have a large pulp mill, and that's where all of the money and all the pollution comes out. It's not the paper machines. The paper machines generally don't use very many chemicals. It's basically a lot of water and taking the pulps and blending the pulps together in a big head box and then making the paper.
We're the 3rd largest producer of pulp.
There you go. Then
We know about pulp. And as far as saying Louisiana, we got them.
well, see, but
And we can smell them.
when you buy a 100% recycled sheet, you do not affect the pulp companies at all. You have no effect on what they're buying, what they're producing. You have no effect on what they're releasing. Last year, according to the EPA, the pulp and paper industry, the pulping itself, released 1,551,000,000,000 gallons of these organochlorines. And you can buy all of the recycled content paper you want that's 100% recycled. You will not affect one down day in a pulping company. Because everybody has to produce the craft pulps in order to make the recycled products that you're buying. So when you go out, and everybody wants to do their very best, and they work hard in studying the pulp and paper industry, but only those that have worked in the pulp and paper industry understand its function and the way it works. So what I would like to leave with you today is the fact that when you buy papers, you need to know that the virgin fiber, and you have to have some virgin fiber, is produced totally chlorine-free. Because if you don't do that, the large paper machines that are running, the large pulping companies that are working, will not change anything. Now, there are a couple of companies, and we have another term that we're using, which is processed chlorine-free, which we want, and you can see the logo is on the copy of what I've handed out. Processed chlorine-free means that the virgin fiber is totally chlorine-free. There's no chlorine or chlorine-containing compounds used in the manufacturing of those fibers. The recycled content, which in this sheet happens to be 20%, and we only talk about post-consumer content, we never talk about recycled content. How many of you guys know what 50% recycled content means? Anybody here know?
I'm not going to say this. That's good. No, you would say it.
50% recycled content means that when I am running my paper machine, the first 3 sets that come off are out of specification. Either they're off in caliper, they're off in color, or they may be off in some other aspect of the manufacturing process. I take those 3 rolls off and I set them off to the side, and then when I get up to speed and I'm making paper correctly, I throw those rolls back in. That's 50% recycled content. It has nothing to do with post-consumer. It has no meaning at all. It was always used in the paper-making process. And the reason that we never told you that it was in there before, because you would have thought maybe there was something inferior with the product, so you didn't want it. So when somebody says that they're 50% recycled content in their paper, what they're telling you is nothing. They've done nothing as far as waste in the waste stream. The only part that isn't anything to do with the waste stream is post-consumer fiber. Now there is a specific definition for that, and there is a way that you are stopping something from going to the landfill, because recycled content at 50% doesn't mean anything. It never did. But those are the way the terms are written. So when it comes to chlorine-free, one of the things that you have to understand is that you have to affect the kraft pulping process in order to affect the paper-making process. And you have to vote with your dollars. Now right now there is a little bit of a premium when it comes to buying chlorine-free papers. And I can tell you some really interesting stories, because when I travel this country around, I have the opportunity to go to a Kinko's store. And generally what I'll do before I go to Kinko's, and I'll get back to why we'll mention them, I'll go into a copy center and I'll ask for totally chlorine-free paper for my copies. The guy looks at me and says, "What do you mean?" I say, "I want a paper that is made totally chlorine-free." And the guy will say, "Well, geez, you know, our recycled papers are over here." I said, "No, this has nothing to do with recycling. This has to do with the actual bleaching process." So then the guy will come back and he'll search around for a little bit and he'll come back and say, "Well, geez, I've got this sheet here, and it's acid-free." I said, No, it has nothing to do with recycling, nothing to do with acid or alkaline. That only has to do with the longevity of the paper. That has nothing to do with bleaching, has nothing to do with anything other than the acidity or alkaline process. So then if the guy gets kind of fed up with me, he'll say, "I don't have any chlorine-free paper," and you can hit the road. Well, I don't accept that sometimes, but if you have a guy that wants to sell you something, he's going to dig a little deeper, and he's going to look a little harder for the paper. And then what they'll do is they'll come out and they'll bring an Eureka 100 or an international paper makes Unity DP, or Georgia Pacific makes another sheet. And they'll bring that out to me and says, "Here, this is 100% recycled." I said, "No, you still don't seem to understand what I'm talking about. I want something that's got virgin, chlorine-free pulp in it, and if it doesn't, I'm not interested." Well, he said, "Well, obviously I'm not going to be able to help you." So then I'll leave that place, and I'll walk on down to a Kinko's, and there are 700 or so Kinko stores around the country, and maybe even 800 in the world, I guess. Kinko's is committed to putting totally chlorine-free and processed chlorine-free papers in all of their stores. And so when I go into the Kinko store and I said, "I'd like to have chlorine-free paper," you're going to have a problem at the very beginning, because they too are not as well educated as they need to be, and as you're going to be when we leave here. They're going to say, "Well, geez, I've got this acid-free sheet again," or they're going to say, "I've got this recycled sheet," and you're going to say, "No, I want a totally chlorine-free sheet." Now, sometimes Kinko's has done a very good job with different regions, and some regions sell chlorine-free a lot more than others. I was involved in the very beginning when Kinko's committed to putting chlorine-free on their shelves, and we overnighted tons of paper around the country to make sure that every Kinko's around the country has it. So you'll have to be a little insistent when the Kinko person comes out and brings you the paper. He's going to ask you. You're going to have to ask him, I should say, what brand is it? Because truly in the U.S. today, there are only 2 brands of totally chlorine-free paper in the market. One, which is produced by a little company that I used to work with, and that's how I've got educated on pulp and paper. I've been in the industry for about 18 years. When it comes to that little company, it was called Lyons Falls Pulp and Paper. And that afforded me the luxury to go around the country and visit with people like yourselves and become educated. And they probably still have some of that paper in their stores, because individual consumers, as yourselves, have not come in and asked for it. And that's one of the big things that our pulp and paper industry points at today, is that there's no demand for totally chlorine-free. Nobody's asking for it. And then when they do ask for it, they generally get misinformation, and so that's another issue that you'll have to contend with. So, and then the other company that's producing, which is the paper that I have my speech written on here, which is called Crosspoint paper. This is the sheet that has got a virgin fiber that is totally chlorine-free, and it's produced out of a little, I should say a large mill, out of Samoa, California, which is called Louisiana Pacific. They're the only craft mill in North America that's producing totally chlorine-free pulp. And they don't make paper, they only make pulp. And then they supply that to Crosspoint, who blends that with a recycled content, which is not rebleached with chlorine, which is made by Lake Superior paper out of up in Duluth, Wisconsin, or Duluth, Minnesota. So those are the only two sheets currently on the market today that are readily available. But we've got a list of 50 different companies around the European markets that can make their products available. And you'll find that those products can be less expensive in some points. If you're buying a very high gloss, #1 quality paper for, say, a book publishing, or for, photographs like a National Geographic or something like that, those papers are readily available, and they're about 8 to 10% less expensive. But when it comes to copy paper, you're going to find that this chlorine-free or processed chlorine-free is a little more expensive. And it's just like recycling was a few years ago, when recycling papers were a little more expensive. People had to demand it, you had to accept the poor quality that some of it was. But then, as things got better, other companies got involved in it, pricing went down, and now it's readily available. And we all understand recycling, even though we've been misled as far as what recycling really means in this country. So that's pretty much in a nutshell. There's an awful lot of information in the speech that I was going to present. But I feel that if you're really interested, the things that we as an association, what we are willing to do, we're focusing truly on paper right now. But there are other things outside, as Joan was talking about, as far as chlorine-free products. Now, we focused on paper because that's what I know, and that's where I came from. But we're also starting to focus on PVC pipe. We're also focusing on air conditioning and CFCs. There's a company called Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York, which is one of the first companies to come out with a total chlorine-free process for their air conditioning units. They've come up with a refrigerant that no longer uses any chlorine-based chemicals. There also is a swimming pool manufacturer out of Providence, Rhode Island, Fountainhead Technologies, which is using a process that is not using any chlorine. And it's quite a unique process for swimming pools. There's also another company that is doing the dry cleaning. They're going to be joining us, the Centers for Neighborhood Technology are going to join us in Chicago when we do a program. We do programs around the country, similar to this, but ours are all dedicated to those who manufacture, those who are converting and turning them into something, those that are specifying it, and then those who are regulating it. And we do that around the country, so that's one opportunity to find a little bit of what we do. Yeah.
How is this whole process so that it comes out white?
See, in the processes, there are 3 or 4 different processes that you can use that will produce something chlorine-free. There's ozone, which is totally a closed-loop system. They never let that chemical out. It goes around and around and around. They use it again and again and regenerize it. There's oxygen delignification, which is also a closed loop. They want to keep the oxygen in because these are expensive chemicals. They use it over and over again. They never release any of it. Then you have hydrogen peroxide, which when it breaks down and it is released, is broken down into oxygen and water. And then you also have enzymes, and there are some other new technologies that are coming out. And enzymes are, if you ever walk through the forest and you see a tree that's broken down and it's into little parts and it's just like disintegrating, it's the enzymes that have eaten away the lignin. And lignin is the glue that holds the fiber together. And in the pulping process, what they're attempting to do is they're trying to eliminate the lignin to make a bright white cellulose, which is what makes the paper. So that's in a nutshell the 3 or 4 different processes. In the European community, they've felt that this chlorine issue is so strong and such an issue for them. And then there's a listing in there of 7 different mills that have gone totally chlorine-free, which are going one step beyond our own mills, and they're closed-looping their mills, which means they'll have no wastewater at all. They will reduce their output of any pollutants, and what that means is that we will no longer have 1 trillion. 551 billion gallons of water being released. I mean, that's the city of New Orleans uses 25 billion gallons of water a year. That's what the city of New Orleans uses, and they use 1,690,000 pounds of chlorine in cleaning your water for you to drink. In a chlorine-free process, you have no organic chlorines being produced, you have no wastewaters being sent out, and you would eliminate that 1 trillion gallons of water. I mean, I called the civil, the Army Corps of Engineers to try to get a flow rate of what that would mean. If you stand out here by the Mississippi and you watch the water flow by, the Mississippi in 1 minute you'll see about 22 million gallons of water flow by in a minute. If you stood out and you took the same statistics of 1,551,000,000,000 gallons, that would be 1/10 of that would be total organochlorines. So the pulp and paper industry last year would have made a river the size of the Mississippi, one-tenth the size of the Mississippi River.
One thing that I wanted to say, just real quickly, unless Florence, you wanna?
Well,
say
I was
something?
gonna talk
Go ahead.
about, shifting the burden.
Good, okay,
Yes,
great.
what we're always confronted with is that, we cannot prove that these chemicals cause these particular health effects. Well, let's digress for just a moment. And put yourself in the position of a person who has a terminal illness. The doctors have told you, I'm sorry, we've done everything that we know to do for you. We've used every medicine that we know. We've used every technique that we know, and none of it's working. And then you hear about some medicine over here that's had some rather remarkable results. It's an option for you. It's really your only option. And you want to use that. But guess what? The Federal Drug Administration says, I'm sorry. This drug has not yet been thoroughly tested. We know that it has side effects, which is a joke when you are just one great big side effect. This drug has side effects. It has not been adequately tested yet. We aren't really sure that it's safe. And you're not allowed to use that drug. Okay? Now let's consider that in America, in the chemical industry, thousands of new chemicals are created each year. And then these chemicals are put into use. And then these chemicals are eliminated from the smokestacks, from the pipes into our rivers, dumped into the land. And we start getting sick, and we say, there's a problem here, and what does government always say to us? What does industry always say to us?
Prove it.
Prove it, yeah. Now, it would seem very logical to me that regulation should be just as stringent for any chemical, and we have no choice but to breathe, or no choice but to drink, or no choice but to eat because it's in our vegetables, as it is for a chemical that is denied a person who's terminally ill. But that situation does not exist, does it? And the other thing, the last point I want to leave with you is simply this. A chemical is not a human being. A chemical is not a citizen. A chemical does not have constitutional rights. A chemical should be decided to be guilty until proven innocent. That's all I have to say.
When Greenpeace released this report, Chlorine, Human Health and the Environment, the Breast Cancer Warning, it was endorsed by more than 20 different scientists in the U.S. and in Canada. And it was really interesting to see the response that we got from the chlorine industry itself. They were saying, well, there's not enough evidence. There is no direct cause and effect link. We need to keep studying the problem. We got to get more information, more research. We got to keep studying the problem. Well, you know, as you were saying, why should the burden of proof be on women and men in their health? The burden of proof really needs to be on those industries to prove that those chemicals are safe before they get into the environment. The chlorine industry, they want us to keep studying the problem, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence right now. If you look at the entire body of evidence, you know, not just breast cancer, but look at all of the health effects between these chlorine-based chemicals and how they're affecting our health. There's more than enough evidence. What we really need to do right now is impact public policy, and science is only one piece of that puzzle. You know, we have strong voices ourselves. You know, morality, religion, ethics, all these different pieces of life should begin to impact public policy, but right now we're really dominated by science. Science is just one piece of the puzzle.
But I think one of the other things you also need to understand is that you can vote with your dollars, and you need to be very specific in your buying and your specifications. Do not accept alternatives, and voice your displeasure with not having that option or that choice made available to you. And I'll tell you what, one thing that'll change the industry very quickly is seeing one competitor have an advantage over another. And when one competitor is selling all that he can produce that's chlorine-free, and the other competitor doesn't have it, you will see him change. He will emulate the other guy. And they will go for that type of research or that kind of market-driven approach. And I think that's really important. I mean, the other side is to lobby, but one of the major things that we can do as individuals is to ask questions and only purchase and vote with our dollars in those specifications.
Okay, we're about to wrap up. Are there any questions? Question, yes.
What about, I said it would take, $20 to go, but what about when you don't have no income coming in at all? Then when you turn on your faucet in your house, the chlorine is so strong that you can almost bleach your clothes with the water that you got to wash yourself with, cook with, eat with. Because in St. James Parish, we do have it just that way. That when it's not strong, when you don't have the chlorine in the water, it rusts looking or yellow looking. And, last year, year before last, you've had continuous oil spills up and down the Mississippi River, from Downsville on back down to Rouge. This happened, every month there was one or two oil spills, or acid spills, or whatever else they had a spill in that river. And, it's kept on and kept on and kept on, and also everybody was filling out the papers to, fill out the application for the sewer, they all stopped it, or continue to stop at once. And now, like I said, nothing have been done.
All right,
They got a lot of people back there, yet sick like I am, and don't have money, don't have no income, don't have nothing. We've been shut out, closed down. We're not even considered as, a citizen.
Yeah.
Because number one, like I said, we don't have money to go to the doctor. We don't have no Medicare card. We don't have no insurance. We don't have no, me, myself, I don't have no income, period. Only thing I'm living off is $115, yet $2 cents a month. And, right now I got, papers to go to the doctor. Before I get myself checked out, I can't go. Cause I got to go away from St. James Parish to home or Louisiana. And have no transportation. And like I said, if we've been shut out, we are cried up and down this river. We are voice our opinion, but yet we have been closed out, ignored. And, next month or two, they're gonna start back planting canes again. And after that, they're gonna start their sugar mill up again. And they're gonna dump their toxic waste right gonna be dumped in our neighborhood. And then at night, you're gonna smell all that, bad gas and all that stuff. There's nothing but chemicals and stuff coming out of there. And, we call the environment, people about that, they haven't did nothing about it. But yet, like I said, a lot of my people in St. James had to give up because they thought there's no hope. But I'm still fighting because I know it's got to be a hope somewhere.
The situation, you know, I've been out to your community, and there are other communities like yours, or, well, but not exactly like yours, but in similar circumstances around the country. I've been talking to some ladies here recently where they're coming from eastern Kentucky, communities where people don't even have running water, where they're going to a creek and dipping up muddy water, and that's all they've got to drink. I mean, there are some conditions here in America, not to mention elsewhere in the world, that are just unbelievable and totally unacceptable, should be totally unacceptable to this society. But what are we going to do? We're sitting here hearing these problems, then we'll get in our air-conditioned cars, we'll drive on off, go to our air-conditioned homes, and pretty much live life as usual. Only thing I can say to you, that's Mrs. Jones, isn't it? Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, is people in your condition, in your community, people in any communities like that, the only thing you can do is band together, and you gotta fight, and you can't give up. You gotta educate yourselves. I know what a fighter you are, Ms. Johnson. You gotta get out there in that community and get other people believing that they can make a difference. And that's the only way it's gonna happen. You've got to be political, and as fewer dollars as you have, you got to make your dollars count. You know, you may not have a lot, but you can make those dollars count, and some of the kind of choices you make as to what you spend that money on and where you spend it. And hook up with some of the other organizations. I think there's a number of different organizations here, and we're going to try to help you as much as we can.
We did look with Gulf Coast Health.
Right, I know that you're working with Gulf Coast Tenant, and through Gulf Coast Tenant, some of these other groups have also been trying to help your community. And all of us, we're down there at the State House, trying to make changes, and trying to make changes in other ways, and we just need continued work from people in communities like yours, as well as, what we're trying to do is activate everybody, get them to see, we can't have situations like this. And I don't have any real answers, and it's not gonna happen overnight. I know that because I know what I've been fighting for the last 8 years in my own community. And the changes are slow and hard to come by, and it's not gonna really happen until more Americans, I think, are really involved in fighting. And I know you all have some other
I was
comments.
just gonna say something really, really quickly. I mean, just as the burden of proof shouldn't be upon us to prove that these chemicals are safe, all of the responsibility should not fall on our shoulders as individuals either. I mean, it's really time for corporations with conscience and for industry with integrity. And we can roll with our dollars, we can use, our limited incomes and try and make an impact, and I think that you're absolutely right, Archie, to do this. But it's time for some of these corporations to start voting with their dollars too. I mean, Time Magazine, with the flick of a pen, Time Magazine could change the
Pulp paper
purchasing
industry,
policy in this country today.
Yep.
In fact, they already made a commitment that they would do it, but they reneged on it. They say that the planet is, Planet of the Year in 1989. They made a commitment. And it's time for some of these corporations to start acting responsibly too.
But
And
why don't they?
But why don't they? Right. We can use our pressure. If each person, this is something really small, but it's something concrete and tangible. If each person took 10 of these postcards and inserted them right into Time Magazine, to get the word out a little bit more, that could make a small difference, because they could really change the whole buying power of paper in this country. It's the U.S. right now that's holding back worldwide momentum toward a totally chlorine-free pulp and paper industry. So corporations need to take responsibility too, and we can pressure those corporations.
Yeah, these things are very, very helpful to do that, because what you'll find is that for the Time Magazine alone, they buy 275,000 tons of paper. Now, a good-sized pulp mill or a good-sized paper mill will run around 200,000 tons a year. So what that means is that, and there are only 104 of them, so you've already transferred one totally over. Now, if Time does it, Business Week is going to follow. Everyone else down the road is going to want to compete. So it is very important that you keep the pressure on for some of that. Yeah. Yeah.
Production company in South Louisiana, we bear more than 50% of, we produce more than 50% of the nation's supply of monochloride and sea products. And so what is that alternative that we can be pushing for?
Well, right now, there are only really two alternatives that we're aware of. One is clay pipe, which is an old process, but still a lot cleaner of a process, and copper. I mean, really, those are the only two alternatives that we've been able to search out right now. Again, we've only been focusing on pulp and paper issues for the long term here. We're hoping to be able to focus on those other issues in the near term. But we are hooking up with the Clay Pipe Institute because they have really been taking a hammering. Yeah.
Are there populations of any fish or animals that are declining or endangered that are a result of this chlorine, that are an indicator of what's really going on to our?
Hundreds.
Which one? Do you have any?
Well,
Are they
locally,
specifically fish?
I can
most
tell
of
you
them?
particularly in the Great Lakes Basin and in the Gulf of Mexico, where these are two ecosystems that have been heavily studied. For instance, in the Great Lakes Basin, right now there are 16 species that are slowly becoming extinct due to the impact of these toxic chemicals. Some of those wildlife are bald eagle, beluga whale, snapping turtle, a variety of different fish. And what scientists are seeing is that the impacts on wildlife, because we're all interconnected, it's the same ecosystem ultimately, the impacts on wildlife have the same impacts. It may take a little bit longer, but it has the same impacts as they do on human health. In the Gulf of Mexico, we're seeing the panther, we're seeing the alligators, there's a lot of
Bearded
connections there.
ladyfish.
We're seeing in our own Louisiana systems, bayous, Mississippi River, the pallet sturgeon. And the pallet sturgeon is a fish that was here long before we were. It's a very ancient fish. And up until, I think it was a year ago, no young sturgeons had been seen. all the sturgeons that had been caught or had been seen were old sturgeons, indicating that sturgeons were not reproducing, and it's being very, very consistent with all the data that we're getting on the effects of the organochlorines on other wildlife species. But I understand that in the last year, I think a young sturgeon was, I don't know how comfortable that is.
One of the things, one thing about organochlorines is that they're very caustic, and the reason that they don't recycle chlorine-based processes is it'll eat the metal. It'll actually eat the actual metal up. But the whales are being so affected by it, they think some of the mass whalings from these organochlorines, it's like an acid bath, and it's causing them to jump out of the water, basically. So these organochlorines are very, very tragic.
Well, I mean, that's one of the causes for stranding. The other have
Yes.
been suspected as being parasites and problems with the Earth's geomagnetic fields around certain parts of in Haiti and other places.
It's been good. You've been a great audience, good and interactive. We've got to move on to our next session, so we're going to ask that you take your break as you go back up to the